Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Competition and Society panel. We're going to, thank you, Danny. My name is Taylor Owings, and I'm going to be the moderator for the next panel that we have for you. The papers that we're presenting and discussing in this panel really call the question of how the biggest problems in society affect our understanding of antitrust law. And joining me on this panel, we have two scholars and four discussants. We're going to start the panel with Mehmet Canayaz, who's an assistant professor of finance and PhD in finance economics. He teaches at Penn State Smeal College of Business, and he'll be presenting his paper, Crafting an AI Compass, the Influence of Global AI Standards on Firms. The commenters and discussants on this paper, we were planning to be joined by Robert Siemens of NYU Stern. He's had a last-minute family emergency, and so Danny has agreed to step in with the comments that Robert sent us last evening, and also to add some additional ones. So it's really a 2-for-1 on the academic discussant. And from the practical perspective, we have Dr. Claire Shea, who's an economic consultant at NERA and PhD in economics, working in the area of IP and antitrust consulting, and whose work brings her in contact with standardization and other questions raised in Mehmet's paper. On our second paper will be presented by Laura Phillips-Sawyer, the Jane W. Wilson Associate Professor of Business Law at the University of Georgia Law School. Her paper is entitled Antitrust Law and Democratic Capitalism, What the Historical Meanings of Market Power Reveal About the Antitrust-Democracy Nexus. And commenting first from the academic perspective will be Eleanor Fox from NYU, and I will take the practical perspective on that paper. So without further ado, we had planned to switch it around, but actually let's go ahead and start with Laura on antitrust law and democratic capitalism.
Okay, could we need to switch the
slides? Oh, is it possible to switch the slides again? Sorry, lots of on-the-fly modifications here.
Let me just pull up this so I don't talk too long. Okay. Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with you guys here today and share these ideas with you. This, as I say in the beginning of the paper on that title page, this is a true working paper. And I know it will go through these rounds of revisions, and I've already learned a great deal from Eleanor in our exchanges on email, so I'm looking forward to more comments, questions, and concerns as those arrive. Okay, so I thought I would say just a few words about framing this project before getting into the project itself. So I was asked to participate in a conference I'm very excited to participate in March on the topic of antitrust law in service of democracy. So for me, as I started to think about how to wrap my head around this issue from a historical perspective, I thought I saw two main challenges. The first is that this is already a crowded field with excellent work by leading antitrust scholars. And much of this work is prospective. It begins with a normative framework, and then it assigns procedural fixes to achieve or to better approach what the law should be doing. And secondly, as a historian, as a legal and business historian, I wanted to avoid what we refer to in history as presentism, that pull of the present to affect the way in which you see the past. So I set out with the goal to fully explore the contingency of these various eras of antitrust law in this post-World War II time period. So I decided to focus on market power and competing conceptualizations of market power. And I did that. I chose that topic as I see it as the sort of leitmotif of antitrust law. So with this framing in mind, I set out to historicize the various meanings of and competing ideas of what constitutes market power and the exercises of market power since the Second World War, and to explain its influence on antitrust law and policy. So in this paper, I have largely used the existing periodization, though we may contest that in the comments and questions period. And I've tried to recharacterize the way in which we think about these different eras of antitrust law by just focusing on this notion of market power in economic theory and its influence on doctrinal change. So I argue that, as a historical matter, antitrust law is not solely a story of the refinement of economic ideas over time. In other words, it's not a story about uneconomic ideas in that immediate post-World War II period influencing doctrine, and then the adoption of price theory and transaction cost economics. Neither, I think, should we really think about the periodization of antitrust as a pendulum, as this regulatory pendulum from heavy regulation to deregulation and then back again. And perhaps we should contest a little bit of the corporate capture story that is gaining momentum in the literature today. So instead, antitrust doctrine seems to have responded to these changing meanings of market power within a wider social scientific community, which perhaps reflected larger societal pressures. So this is a sort of externalist interpretation of changes to the law, and these problems arising in US political economy. Now, I'm not sure that this actually gives antitrust law meaningful democratic content, but perhaps the story, this intellectual history, situates antitrust law within the demos, such that we may evaluate not only the law, how the law has taken its present form, but also where it should go next, given new social science data. So for the purposes of my very brief remarks here, I might just focus our attention on this issue of perhaps exclusion, right? So this part of, this one aspect of thinking about the exercises of market power. So at least since the 1950s, at times, courts have used the terms market power and monopoly power interchangeably. In the paper, I take them as qualitatively similar. And the Supreme Court has defined that monopoly power from 1956 DuPont case as that power to control prices or to exclude competition. However, through the process of writing this paper, it seems that that second element, that exclusion element, that what Steve Salop refers to as that raising rivals' costs, has provided this important ground for contestation across various schools of thought. So in that early time period, and you'll see this is pretty standard periodization, although you may contest the 1974 and want it to be 1978, but nevertheless, this is the standard periodization. And what I do is I try to explain the larger political economy context that I think is pushing the economic theory, which then is used to make convincing arguments in antitrust economics to shift doctrine. So that's how I ground this slide, which I don't have time to fully explore, but I hope it's self-explanatory. So I want to end by just saying one thing about democracy and democratic capitalism. As we reflect on the democratic content of antitrust law, we may note that this exclusion element of the exercise of market power has played this critical role. With Joe Bain, who we refer to as the Harvard School, despite the fact that he was at Berkeley most of his career, and his emphasis on those barriers to entry and that being exclusionary in some cases, making concentration more of a problem for performance and conduct. But that exclusionary aspect falls out with Stigler and Easterbrook's emphasis on error cost analysis as well. But I emphasized how Arita and Turner played a role in that transformation as well. In the 21st century, we see a return to thinking about exercises of market power, not just in supra-competitive pricing, but also as a means by which exclusion can happen in a marketplace. So what does this have to do with democratic capitalism? So I emphasize this idea of exclusion as an important ground of contestation in this conceptualization of market power, because I think that it plays a role in a larger political and economy conversation about the egalitarian promises of democracy, of democratic capitalism, to be clear. Namely, protecting a decentralized economic system that empowers entrepreneurs and workers, that may drive innovation, and that also legitimizes market competition. So with all of that at sort of stratospheric level, we can talk doctrine as well, but I'll leave that here. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Eleanor?
Okay. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here and a great pleasure to be able to comment on your paper, Laura. So I will make some remarks that go to some things in your paper that you haven't just said. And the paper is extremely interesting, extremely timely, because we are in a, as you might say, inflection period where antitrust is very much on center stage on a lot of agendas, and people are arguing which is the better perception of antitrust, and market power comes into this picture quite a lot. So let me go through your periodization, and in your paper, the claim is that you're doing your historicization through the use of market power. And I want, and we'll get to a recommendation on how I think you might add to your use of market power. So you go through three periods. The first period is what I will call the structural period. And that was a period from 1945, case Alcoa, through about 1974, or the beginnings of the fall of the Warren Court. There was a very strong consensus that structure, and this was the Harvard paradigm, that structure is going to almost determine performance, structure, conduct, performance paradigm coming out of what was then the Harvard School. And then in your paper, you talk about a next period, which you begin at 1974. And in your paper, you say this represents a new learning, and it's true, a lot more economics came in at that point. And it's also true that competition law at that point had been pretty direct of economics and had lots of political economy views embodied in it. So you talk about the new learning as an elevation of conduct over power. I want to contest the way you frame this because it implies that power was no longer important and that conduct was now very important. And what I want to say is power actually became more important in terms of it became harder to prove because it was then necessary to prove in much more economic detail how a firm had market power. And conduct became very important, but conduct, especially collusion, became very important. And your point about exclusionary conduct became actually less important. And the new school of thinking, or at least one school of thinking, was don't focus on exclusionary conduct, or you will be focusing on helping competitors who want to lessen the competition. You don't want to help inefficient competitors. You want to help competition, and you want to help consumers, and not exclusionary conduct, except in those rare cases where exclusionary conduct is also causing price to go up and hurting consumers. So I would say in this new period of time, the new thought was both to tighten up how you must prove market power, and it was providing a conceptualization of what is conduct that counts as anti-competitive that was mostly not about exclusionary. In your paper at this point, you mentioned the Harvard School and Chicago School. I want to say a word about that in a minute. But your third period is this period, right? And it's a period where neo-Brandeis has become very important. We look back just a few years where the almost entire consensus was pretty stable of the strong consumer welfare paradigm to decide cases. And it was a cutback of antitrust, a big cutback of the purview of antitrust, especially in monopolization cases. And then we come to this period of time, which is about 1915, 16, 17, where there became a pushback that antitrust is doing nothing, that our economy is becoming really concentrated. We, the people, are not seeing how antitrust works for us. Something has to happen to change the competition system. So let me just move back to the Harvard and Chicago School, which you go into at some length and very interestingly. And you do talk about what Bill Kovacic came up with, the idea of the double helix, where Chicago and Harvard became somewhat intertwined. And I want to say here, Chicago School as an epithet became known for something very particular, which is more particular than a pretty broad range that is the tent in which Chicago School people live. And that particularity, that is the epithet, has come to mean, Chicago School means you use premises which are pretty neoliberal. Market almost always works. Intervention is almost always bad. Trust the market, don't trust the government to come in with intervention. And that will make people better off, and look at the consumers in particular, it will make consumers better off. And Harvard stood for look at structure of markets and administrability of rules, and that concentrated structure is going to hurt people, including consumers. And I agree with you that the two schools sort of came together, but what I think could be more particularized is that Chicago School, in its broader and more real sense, included a much broader range than those what we call Chicago premises, and that you didn't have to be at Chicago School to be Chicago School, like Harold Demsetz at UCLA, and you didn't have to, and if you were at Harvard, you might actually be adopting a lot of Chicago School views about let the market work much more than it was allowed to work in the 1960s. And I would say, look at Steve Breyer, for example. So it was almost inevitable that there would be an intertwining. But I want to make a main point here, which is I think you need another period in your periodization because, as we all know, I mean, there was this period of 1960s and into mid-1970s where antitrust law was expanding and there was very little economics in the law. And then there was a huge consensus and group of people who wanted to push antitrust to be more economic. And that could include more mainstream, who I will include Steve Breyer, but it could be more neoliberal like Harold Demsetz. And those two groups didn't care. They were a group. There came a time when 1980s, law became more economic, certainly satisfied both the centrists and the neoliberals. And then there came a time where, especially turn of the century, where the law became, that is, as said by the Supreme Court, it became more neoliberal. There was definitely another period. Okay, I think I have to wind up, and let me say what I want to say about a recommendation. My recommendation is how you use market power. I think that there's an opportunity to look at the cases over this period of time, you can pick cases across the timeline spectrum, where you see how hard and how easy it is to prove market power. And you also, at least at some periods of time, will recognize that it was power, not just technical market power, but it was power. The Warren Court was against accumulated power. And that brings in your idea of democracy, although democracy has to be linked more, but a social concern for these companies have too much power. And that comes back again right now with neoliberalism. And through this period of time, when there was a strong, almost consensus, structural consensus that power was bad and market power was part of it, my hypothesis is much less need to call out all the economists to prove that Google has market power, and maybe it doesn't, maybe it does, we'll see. First period of time, not hard to prove. Second period of time, gets very hard to prove. And third period of time, we're in it right now. The administration is trying to push back on how hard it is to prove that Google has market power. Thank you.
So I'll offer some comments on some practical considerations as an antitrust practitioner that I observed in the paper, and then Laura these will be framed as questions, and we also very much invite questions from the audience. So please be thinking along those lines. So picking up on something that Eleanor said about the framing of the paper in three parts, right? Three sort of historical periods. I take the claim of the paper to be a helpful invitation to reframe what is currently very much the sort of axiomatic basis of the debate about what's going on in antitrust today, which is that we're on some sort of long arc in antitrust, that there's a single chronology of antitrust, and it's either sort of arcing toward economics, or maybe it's arcing away from democratic principles or populist principles, but needs to return to those principles. And so I see you as inviting the reader to reframe that chronological viewpoint, and instead invite us to think of our understanding of antitrust law and market power in particular as more of an if X, then Y. If X social situation is present, then you see Y sort of interpretation of market power, interpretation of what antitrust law should do. And I see you as presenting the X in this framing as being various anxieties around sort of political economy anxieties. And in the first period, and so I'm going to borrow completely and not rehash anything that Eleanor said. So in the first period she talked about, I see you as presenting as the anxiety of the day. This is, immediately after World War II. The social anxiety of the day was corporate consolidation, and that was arising from fear of fascist political movements. That was the kind of social anxiety of the day, and that the answer to that fear of fascist political movements was seen in antitrust law and the conception of market power as desiring decentralization, and therefore market power and structuralism being helpful to that cause. And then the next period, the anxiety I see you calling out in is the double helix period that Eleanor summarized, is anxiety about American competitiveness. And these are phrases I'm borrowing from you. I'm fully rehashing here. But to frame it up, I see you as presenting that as the anxiety. American competitiveness was doubted, and the answer in antitrust law was to question how durable market power really is, and to allow, therefore, for American firms to become more powerful in response to this concern about American competitiveness. And then in the third section, basically today, the third period, you're framing it up as the anxiety du jour is around platforms and the role of big technology-enabled platforms to dictate outcomes in our life. And you talk about market power. The answer in market power doctrine is around two-sidedness, focus on upstream monopsony, which could also be seen as one side of a two-sided platform. I think this framing is really interesting and adds something very new to the debate. The question I would flip back to you is, if you're thinking of it as an if X, then Y, it might be helpful to look at other times when anxieties of the similar kind were present in the American economy, maybe elsewhere in the world, and look and see if we get the same then Y response through competition law. So for instance, if you take the if X then Y framework as applied to today, how might we think of anxiety around platforms and two-sided platforms today as being echoed in historical contexts in the past, right? Is there something you can say about railroads and anxieties around the power of railroads and the two-sidedness there? Maybe banks, maybe newspapers. Is there some way of finding additional historical examples of the X that you identify as a social anxiety to help build out the sense that this isn't just a one-way arc, but something you see going back and forth throughout history? And then the other point that I just wanted to draw out, which is extremely practical, because again, I'm a practitioner, and I could see using this paper to think about sort of predictively where the current debate about antitrust trends is going. And you have some helpful content in there about the procedural strain of antitrust around how we ought to go about antitrust, whether it's legislative reform, changes in common law doctrine, or rulemaking, et cetera. It's helpful to be able to, as a practitioner, to predict where that's going. The two sort of practical pieces I'd invite some additional thinking or clarity around is it's not a given for me how you frame up suspect conduct under the antitrust laws as requiring an element of market power for the conduct piece of the offense. Yes, all of us who practice Section 2 law know that market power, the dangerous probability of market power, is an element of the Section 2 offense, but you have an assumption in there, I think, that the second element, we break down into the second bucket of conduct. You have an assumption in there that conduct has to be made possible by the fact that the entity has market power. And I think, the great example that, sort of I remember learning in law school and we sort of laugh about when we think about criminal Section 2 cases is that you could set fire to a competitor's factory, and that would be Section 2 conduct. It doesn't require you to have market power. It just requires you to have like a match, right? So expanding a little bit on whether that has been an assumption in cases in the past, or whether it ought to be if it were to sort of be, if we ought to return to that, just kind of clarifying that piece of it. And then there's also a similar treatment of mergers as they relate to market power. I think engaging a little bit with whether mergers are problematic because they confer market power versus confer the ability of firms to coordinate would be helpful as well. I would invite any questions from the audience. Absolutely, thank you.
There we go. Okay. To your point, Taylor, you just discussed in your feedback in the context of the Section 2 violation. But what about in the context of a Section 1 of the coordinated acting in concert version of that? Like, how does that, are there any differences in the way that these concepts play out compared to the Section 2, which is monopoly?
Yeah, I would flip that to Laura and say, do you have a desire to focus more exclusively on Section 2, or I know you discuss mergers in a very sort of pointed way in the paper, but what about Section 1?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I started writing the paper thinking I would focus exclusively on anti-monopolization, on just Section 2 cases, but that didn't hold. So, setting aside the category of illegal per se, we think about all rule of reason cases involving some type of measure of market power, and the thresholds are different regarding the type of conduct that is at issue. But I was almost immediately drawn into Section 1 cases like Brook Group having to do with predatory pricing, and then, of course, Matsushita as well, which were Section 1 cases. Brook Group arises under the Robinson-Patman Act that is treated as a Section 2 case. So yes, there are Section 1 cases in there where I think about these issues of market power and collusion, tacit collusion, in the Baynian sense of excluding others, even in adjacent markets. But I guess the thrust of the paper has really been with monopolization, Section 2, and then some with mergers. So I think it comes in and comes out, but it is still being formed. So sort of a halfway answer, I suppose.
Hello, my name is Angelica Novoa. I'm from the Dominican Republic. I'm looking forward to read your essay, and I wonder, I see clearly that you took very well into account what was the regulatory or the policy shifts in the different areas, considering the consumer welfare, the consumer benefit or point of view. But I wonder if you also consider that market power was the main object of your research, how the firms react in those different areas or periods to the policy making. For example, because you start with World War II, which is of course an international event, but in the second period, as Eleanor mentioned, there was a very important moment for North American firms to expand market power because of globalization. And nowadays, because of because they have the threat of having other competitors outside the United States, for example, firms, especially digital firms, are coming from China and other jurisdictions that has an important market power. So I wonder if you took into account what was the reaction, the policy reaction to the offer request, or the offer's point of view about how the policy should back them. Excuse my English, which is not too good.
So if I understand the question correctly, you're asking about how this story interacts with the larger American policies for globalization and
Right.
increasing, or rather perceived decline of American competitiveness. I think that it's a really important part of the story to look at how these macro events within the real economy are giving greater force to arguments that Stigler is making at the time about the difficulty to obtain and then retain market power during this moment of increased globalization, when European producers are coming back online after being decimated by World War II, as are Japanese producers, and then increasingly importing into the United States. So I think that those Stigler's ideas pre-exist the phenomenon that that I think helps make them more popular and then gain greater momentum. So I hope that answers your question there.
So I'd like to address Eleanor's comment about whether or not you can prove Google's market power. It seems to me that the Europeans finding Facebook, Google, and Amazon seem to be leading the charge in this area of digital commerce, and they don't have a difficulty in figuring out the domination of the U.S. platforms. So the U.S. seems to be behind the curve, to say the least.
I think this comment goes to something I was saying about you have I think maybe unpulled thread a little bit in your introduction on the process that we ought to use, or the process that has been used to answer antitrust questions, right? And the different way that Europe is going about this. And so I think maybe the question draws out that there might be some interest in expanding on the procedural thread that you kind of introduce.
Yeah. So to that point, I think that one of the difficulties about writing about democracy, small d, democratic influence within antitrust law, is that it's an incredibly technocratic field. And so I wrote this paper trying to find democracy, and I just found a whole lot of technocracy. And so it's a mission unfulfilled, but yet it's one that I think with greater breadth, I think can be borne out. And the American system is a peculiar one to focus on, this common law thread. And part of the Chicago story is overturning jury verdicts based on economic rationale. And so there is this, real tension within telling the story, because I don't know if I really want to tell a story that looks like a height of democracy and then its decline and its, climb back, because there does seem to be some kind of consensus, some double helix, to use Bill Kovachik's term, that seems to be happening. But Eleanor and I have been, debating over the validity of that double helix for the past couple weeks, and so I'm refining that idea. Yeah, thank you.
This is a very general question, but it's one that I have, having listened to this debate for a while now. When we look at the periods that you identify where antitrust changed, the change in antitrust was part of a bigger change. So when you see the after World War II, antitrust becomes concerned about fairness and kind of structure, but at the same time you have other equalitarian policies, right? You have Social Security, you have education, and then you have the 70s, and then come the 80s when antitrust become neoliberal. And you also have all these other policies, right, where the welfare standards, the welfare support becomes smaller, market instruments are introduced everywhere. And now the debate about more equality, it's only antitrust. Like, I don't see that reflected, or maybe I'm missing, but I don't see a bigger movement in society towards, we need a fairer distribution, we need less concentration of power. It's really limited to antitrust. And so that makes me question a little bit where this is coming from, or the strength or the impact that this is going to have. And it's really an open question, but we don't feel it's part of a bigger movement. It's really an antitrust discussion, which is very different, I think, with the situations that were happening in other periods.
So I agree with you, particularly on the earlier periods. As an historian, we talk about the post-World War II liberal consensus that creates all of these programs together, and then that sort of deregulatory moment that begins with the Carter administration and introduces many market reforms and begins with Civil Aeronautics Board deregulation and such. But I think that we would find, so I have two thoughts. I think that we would find other legal domains that are moving in the similar direction to antitrust, perhaps, if we look closely. I think we've been doing a lot of hiring lately at my school, and a lot of people come in and, we're looking at tax, and people want to talk about some progressive wealth taxes and things like that. There is this movement, I think, that, so there is some confluence there. I'm less well-versed to speak to I think, this present moment of synergies than the historical elements. But I do think that there are these confluences there. And I lost track of my second thought, sorry. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting observation, and I would like to say this about it. I do think that the inequality debate is across many fields. I do think, though, that the antitrust inequality debate has gotten fueled by two different things. One is a huge amount of literature showing that as there is increasing concentration and increasing market power and increasing markups in our society, there's also increasing inequality of wealth and power. And the thought or idea that if antitrust were more on its toes in preventing and controlling the market power, there would be less inequality, just maybe marginal, but less inequality. And the second is that this idea is across the world, that there has been increasing use of and thought about antitrust and inequality. And just small piece for South Africa, that's sort of the heart of the South African competition law. The fairness and the distribution issue are very, very vibrant today, like they have never been before. Neither Harvard nor Chicago was on the track of putting distributional issues into competition law. They were both about the kind of economics that you would put into competition law.
So just really quickly, I remembered my second thought. So I think that the really interesting thing about antitrust law is that it often, historically speaking, has led in changes to economic regulation. Yes, the ICC precedes the Sherman Act, but nevertheless, I think that antitrust does much more than ICC ever does, right? And so I think that antitrust is a nice place to look for these types of changes to occur.
All right, we're going to move now to our second paper. So I would love to invite Mehmet to walk us through the claims of the paper.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I'm Mehmet Canayaz. I'm a assistant professor of finance at Penn State, and I'll be presenting joint work with Zhi Wang, who also is at Penn State. Today I'm going to talk about AI standards, and I look forward to your comments because this is the first version of the paper, and I'm sure you're going to come up with good questions. Okay, so as you may know, we as humans, as species, are now surpassing intellectual capabilities. There's a paper published by OpenAI last year that shows that GPT-4 achieves top 10% scores in several professional and academic benchmarks. So it is clear now that we will never be at the same level as AI. And the question now is not how we can catch it. The question is now, how we can adapt AI technologies, how we can include AI in our lives, in our economies, so that we can have a positive externalities or positive effects, a positive effect on the societal welfare. So that should be the question. The problem is the broader adoption of technology, including AI, requires globally understood guidelines and principles, which are AI standards. How do we know this? We know this from the literature. If you look at several literatures, in econ, we know that once a standard is set, then the firms are compelled to align their investments accordingly. Until a standard is set, they just wait because there's a lot of uncertainty. We can see, for example, if you look at the patenting activity, investment activity in telecommunications industry from 1G to 5G, every time a standard is set, there's an increase. There's like a structural break in patenting activity. So the question is, what are AI standards, and then how these are set, and how we can sort of benefit from this as a society. So to give you an example of AI standards, so consider a scenario where an AI self-driving vehicle must choose between harming pedestrians, including children, for example, or its own passengers. And the AI has to decide what technical and ethical criteria should AI follow. Should it prioritize the safety of its passengers, the elderly, or the children, the most educated, the richest, the poorest? We don't know. There are no standards yet. Here's, by the way, an image from the moral machine experiment that sort of studies this question. So here's a pseudocode. I just assumed that the algorithm should sort of protect the children. Okay, so this algorithm, it's an AI, it's an example of an AI. Basically, uses data to predict which person is a child, and tries to detect the children. And if there are children on the street, then it's like, it tries to protect the children. Otherwise, it will try to predict the passengers. But even this basic algorithm is fundamentally dependent on different standards related to AI. First of all, this is a pseudo algorithm. In real life, there will be a program which will be written based on some standards set by committees on programming and software. So you're going to depend on that. Part of your data will depend on collecting data on pedestrians, vehicles, walls, trees, traffic. So you will have to follow certain criteria that are set by data interchange committees in your code. Part of that data will be read. I don't know if you can read my code, but part of that data will be read into a function to extract features for you to be able to detect children. Those activities will be dependent on standards set by personal identification, human biometrics, standards like that. And once you have identified certain features, then you're going to have to make a decision, a prediction, which is basically a statistical model using those features and using that data. And that model will try to predict, is there a child or not in that crowd? So that will involve, in the basics, the simplest of the examples is an OLS regression in which you will have to estimate statistical equation where a coefficient is equal to x transpose x inverse x transpose y, and this x transpose x inverse may have 1 trillion rows and columns which you will never be able to invert. That's why you need an algorithm to estimate what that's equal to. But that algorithm will be based on machine learning algorithms, some standards set by machine learning researchers. At the end of the day, you will also have to assume that you're going to make some error, and you're going to have to make a call on, what's a acceptable probability of error, what's a type 1 error, how do you define type 1 error, how much type 1 error or type 2 error do you accept, which will be based on AI ethics standards. And finally, that model will act based on standards set by device control and other similar committees. So as you see, all of these standards will have a significant effect on how the AI will behave. And if, for example, your machine learning algorithm is not trained on the right type of data, for example, the right type of face image quality assessment model, you use the wrong types of model, your data was biased towards certain ethnicities, towards certain income groups, you will have to retrain your model, most likely, which is going to be costly. So the idea is, firms need to understand what the standards are before they make investment decisions. They generally wait for those standards to be clear, and then they make investment decisions. And the government is aware of this. The US strategy aims to shape the global AI standards to benefit the US firms. They understand the game. And the game this is how I describe the game to my people in my department. The game is similar to the editor, referees, and publication model in academia. There will be editors. These are going to be the secretariats that lead the effort. They don't decide on their own, obviously, on which standard will be passed or not. They will need referees, which are the countries in their committees that are following their efforts. And then the standards themselves will be like publications. So the standards will be voted by the members of the leaders of the committees. And then if they pass the vote, they will be accepted. And then firms will react based on which standards, what types of standards are accepted. So the supportive committee members are the key. So this figure shows you, for example, the US has the leadership position in industrial data, interoperability, programming languages, data interchange, this type of committees. But the US is not deciding on its own. There are other committees that are being led by other countries. And if you look at this globally, several countries vote on how these standards are set. So there's a lot of different country participation in the process. So this map shows the bivariate map. It shows on the y-axis, this figure shows on the y-axis the countries that are leading the efforts. These are the secretariats. And the x-axis shows the committees. These are the members that vote under the secretariat of these countries. So the purple area or the dark blue area is the US. US is not only leading a lot of these efforts, but also voting in a lot of the standardization process. But US is not alone. As you see, the red area, these are the countries that do not have any leadership positions, but they have a significant influence on which standards pass because they have a lot of refereeing jobs to do. So this is why it matters a lot if you have support under your secretariats. And these secretariats, they vote on different things, from technical AI standards to ethical AI standards. As you see, the purple area, which is on the upper right corner of the bivariate figure, correspond to countries that vote on machine learning standards, it's a technical standard, but also vote a lot on ethics and accountability. So you need, you need committee members to follow your agenda, to be able to pass the types of standards that your companies demand, that are incompatible with their incentives. So I'm not going to take too much of your time with the empirical specification and the theoretical model. So we do have a theoretical model that sort of explores how AI standards impact investment decisions of firms. So those of you who are interested in theory, I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. On the empirical side, we basically test our theoretical assumptions empirically, and the effect that we want to estimate is the effect of AI standards on firm-level decisions such as investments, R&D, in the later versions of the papers. Now we have investments on AI, specifically on AI. We're going to look at that as well. Needless to say, you cannot just run an OLS regression and run R&D on log of standards because of indigeneity. And we have a two-stage least square procedure that benefits from exogenous shocks on AI standards. I am happy to talk more about this if you are interested. But so what we use is a paper. It's an identification methodology of a paper on the JPE. It's a very popular paper that uses the percentage of UN Security Council members. So the rotating members change in an unpredictable manner. And if you are a country that sort of benefit from that, and if you also have secretariats, you can use your position in the UN Security Council to give gifts to these countries so that they follow your agenda. So that's sort of the identification strategy. And this is a well-established technique in the literature. So in summary, let me show the results. So we do find a positive effect of AI standards on investments. In terms of the magnitude of the effects, a standard deviation increase in AI standards corresponds to about 0.4, 0.3 standard deviations increase in CapEx and R&D, which I think is reasonable. In terms of the composition of the standard, so there are differential effects driven by different types of standards. Machine learning standards, data standards, interchangeable data interchange, machine and equipment standards, automation standards. These all have positive effects on investment and R&D. We found a lot of effect heterogeneity in privacy standards. When it comes to ethics and accountability and privacy, certain committees seem to have positive effect and certain committees seem to have negative effect, and certain industries may seem to benefit from these, and then certain industries are not benefiting. On the net, there's a very the effect seems to be very heterogeneous across different clusters. But on the net, there's a zero effect at this point. We do also have an estimation of how this affects firm value. And once again, we estimate positive effect of AI standards that sort of increase over time as well. So there is some effect dynamics. The effect of AI standards on valuation seems to increase over time. So on that note, given the time constraint, I would like to summarize our findings. There is the adoption of AI standards significantly impacts investment decisions of firms. Firms care a lot about these. And machine learning, data interchange, automation standards seem to positively affect investment. Privacy seems to have on the net zero effect, but as I said, there's heterogeneity. US needs to prioritize, pushing its agendas in certain committees, in certain geographies, which I'm happy to talk more about if you're interested. In terms of the committees, the committees on industrial data, programming languages, interoperability, automation, IT governance seem to have the most positive effect. So the US is doing really well in these committees. Impact on firm value, as I said, is a positive effect of AI standards on firm value, and there's a significant effect dynamic, so the effect seems to increase over time. All right, so this is it from me. Thank you very much again, and I look forward to comment and question. Thank you.
To keep us on time, let's have the initial comments from Danny and Claire at 5 minutes each.
So thank you. I'm not Rob. He's better looking. He knows more about AI. I teach AI, but he really knows AI. So some of these comments are his, some are mine. So just recap, right? AI technology standards leads to more capital and R&D investment, really important. This isn't not surprising. This looks very much like other areas, as Mehmet has mentioned. And on the non-technical standards, more investment and new firm entry. So number one, the big takeaways, this is cool data, unique data sets, and it's not just with regard to AI. So let me just stop there and say, we've seen this. I've come from Los Angeles, so everything to me is in the form of a movie or television show or both. I'd be like, oh, this is a reboot of stuff I've seen before, but in a somewhat new setting. And what's interesting, particularly to a crowd that is largely antitrust focused, like, oh, we've seen standard setting before. What about patents specifically? And what about patents specifically? Because we think, aha, the possibility of AI holdup once we have standards. So instead of just looking at R&D, might we also look at patents? And here I want to distinguish two things. I don't mean AI-assisted patenting for those of you who have seen the Federal Circuit decision. I actually mean patents about AI. So in a New York Seinfeldian way, for those of you who still remember, this is like Kramer's coffee table book about coffee tables. So that's something that I want us to be thinking about sort of in terms of next step. The other thing here is there's a really cool instrumental variable, and this is the 2-year rotations and the UNSC membership. And I also want to note sort of what makes for a nice paper. We were talking about that earlier. So here it's empirical, but there's a nice model to go with it. So this is really important. So one thing here that I'd noticed, there's a lot of real knowledge. This is one of Rob's point of like, wow, you actually understand standard setting, because a lot of papers actually don't. So one area that I'd ask you to draw from, and this is not Rob, but this is me channeling Rob of like, wow, I'm in the management department. There's a lot of strategy/management literature focusing on the kind of gamesmanship that gets played in standard setting organizations that I would tell you to draw from, though Rob didn't suggest that. I'm going to channel Rob and be more Rob than Rob. So, one thing that Rob focused on is he liked all the econometric aspects about it here. Like, A, you explain why you need the IV. B, you have a careful discussion of why it's appropriate. You do the placebo, the placebo test, etc. So he had some quibbles, and then I'll have my own quibbles. I already gave you one quibble, but this was mostly him, less me. So one point that he makes, and I agree with, is that the sequencing of standard bodies isn't random, and that technical oftentimes precedes non-technical. But actually, I will take his quibble yet one step further, which is it endogenous or exogenous? Because how much of the technical standard is happening at the same time as country level, discussions that are of a non-technical nature? Or my favorite, as of the other week, the Pope, who has 1.2 billion followers, by the way, more than many of the countries there, has now his second of 2 pronouncements on AI. And so you'd say, well, what authority, does the Pope have? With great respect, by the way, let me be clear. And the answer is there's a lot of moral persuasion. So you think about formal mechanisms of law and standard setting, and I'm telling you that informal norms really matter. 1.2 billion people. So that's one thing I'd note. The second thing here is a timing issue that Rob raises. And, it's not just when do things happen, but is there some kind of strategy about the timing? Here, you and I have already talked about some work going back to semiconductors in the 1990s in the strategy literature to think about. And so then there's Rob comments, and then there's my separate comments. So Rob is concerned, if you believe the results, you might think it's a bad idea to pass standards or regulations, and that this could potentially be a mistake. But he notes also that the focus is on firms, but society cares about a lot of things, which is actually a very nice way to tie to the last presentation that we just saw as to sort of like, what is it that we're trying to maximize here? It's not always clear. But in some ways, this reminds me of other areas of standards, and that would be more on the privacy side. So, people look at GDPR and they say like, oh, competition suffers because we get a standard, be careful what you wish for. But then if you're European, you're like, I don't care about the economics. I care about, rights. And that looks very different in other parts of the world. We don't care about privacy or rights. We're in season 16 of The Real Housewives of Orange County, after all. But part of it is sort of what I call economic modesty about we are measuring certain things because we can measure those things, and sort of just leave to the side that there are these other questions, and sometimes that's the sort of qualitative management work that can really focus, or the law side. But overall, I think very nice job. I'm going to stop there because I know Claire has a lot to say.
Well, first I want to say thank you for having me here today. And I know we're short on time, but I really just have to say this. As a practitioner who's looked up standards on standard setting websites, collecting the data you've collected takes tremendous effort. So the data is on a global basis for multiple years. And they didn't just collect the data. And they did content analysis to sort the standards into different categories. So what you're seeing is machine learning, privacy, ethics. They did work to analyze the standards. So that just takes tremendous effort. And I really enjoyed reading the paper. So I have 3 high-level comments. And the first relates to instances that you find zero effect. So those are voluntary standards we're talking about. So I wonder where you find zero impact, whether it's because they're truly or no effect, or because firms are just simply not adopting it because they expect there will be adverse consequences. And my second comment relates to the timing. I think in technical standards in 5G, for example, where the schedule of standardization is published ahead of time, firms may well set their investment decisions with the anticipation of when standards will be set. And I don't know if this is happening, what I'm going to suggest is happening here necessarily, so it's just a question. I wonder on certain types of standards like privacy, ethics, whether when they will be set or the content in the standards are well known ahead of time, so firms know to react accordingly. So long story short, I wonder to what extent there will be lagged effects as opposed to the contemporary effects that you explore in the paper. And I think you have the data to explore all of that. And the last one relates to heterogeneous impact on firms. So, so we know that there are a lot of benefits or potential benefits from standardization. But on the flip side, the concern is, what if incumbents or a dominant firm is using standardization to exclude competitors. And again, this is another area that you already have the data to explore, I think, just how does standardization or different types of standardization affects different types of firms. So those are my 3 high-level comments.
Please, yes.
Thank you so much for these honestly, very, very useful comments. I cannot respond to everything, but I will pick some questions. So patent-specific standards, I completely agree. We have actually started to collect data on this, and we will include. So these are like the AI patents that I was referring to. We will definitely have this in the paper. So with regards to your question about like first technological standards and then like ethical standards being like ordered like that, I completely agree. So now we are collecting data on the dynamics of this, because like standards get also like rewritten over time. That's why we need to understand the dynamics of this. The data collection is very tough. It's like you have to click a button and then something opens up, and then you have to click another button, and you have to do this like thousands of times. So we are working on this. We also think that both Zia and I think this is extremely important, actually. I'm glad that you brought this up. So with two of your points were voluntary standards. Did you say zero effect and firms not adverse? So about firms adopting these, so we also think this is also important. We have also we are now looking at whether firms actually cite these standards in 10K document, like different types of disclosures. It took a while, but I think now we have the data. We have all firm citations of ISO standards. All we have to do is like categorize which ones are AI standards. So we are working on that as well. But this is very fair. All of these are very fair and well taken. In terms of anticipating the standards, I do agree that there is definitely some anticipation going on. I would be lying if I said otherwise. What we did was we also looked at future changes in future standards to predict today's investments. We didn't find significant effects in general, but I don't think that's because there isn't. It's just like, I guess statistically it's not easy to show. I don't know, but I do agree that there's definitely some anticipation. I cannot argue against it. So thank you again for all these comments.
All right, we've reached the conclusion of our session, and we are taking a break now, and the sessions will resume at 3:50.